Salutations! Welcome to Monomythic, and today's topic, small press comics. I'm Kevin Garcia, professional comic book historian, and joining me today is the founder of Antarctic Press and the creator of Ninja High School, Ben Dunn. Ben,
hello.
Welcome. How are you doing?
Good.
And also joining us is the creator of Halloween Man and Lucy Chaplin's Science Starlet, Drew Edwards. Drew, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Howdy, y'all.
Hi. Well, I just want to talk to you guys real quick about what it's like creating small press, what it's like being independent publishers in the comic book industry, why people should do this, why people should go in and be on their own to create, also the pitfalls of it, why it might be a problem or why it might be difficult. And Ben, I want to start with you because you started Antarctic Press, co-founded it in 1984, began Ninja High School, your most well-known book, in 1987. How did that get started? How did you first get into that? What made you want to become your own publisher?
Well, I always say I just didn't want to do a regular job. I was in the college at the time. I teamed up with a friend of mine. We borrowed some money. We decided that we went to start our own comic book company. At the time, direct distribution to comic stores was starting to grow. The advent of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles showed that a small press company could actually make some decent impact on the comic industry. So we decided to follow suit by creating our own comic book company, Antarctic Press, and just started doing comic books ever since.
Now, you mentioned Ninja Turtles. That was what a lot of people called the black and white boom, and also kind of led to a black and white bust. There were a lot of really, really, dedicated comic book companies that were just trying to make it in the 80s and early 90s. And a lot of them, Antarctic Press is one of the few that are still around from that time that have persevered and been able to make a name for it. What do you think enabled Antarctic Press to last that long?
Oh, that's a good question. Luck? I don't know. I think it's our just basic philosophy is that, just keep at it. You try to find ways to squeeze every penny you can, try to be efficient, try to be creative, try to, tap into, whatever the zeitgeist is at the time, and just create the product. One of the biggest things is that you can solicit or offer things all day long, but if you don't come out with anything, it doesn't help your company at all. It's just merely getting things out.
Now, Drew, you started yours in the year 2000.
In the year 2000.
Yeah. Well, how did you?
Sounded
that
so futuristic then.
It still
That's
does to me.
That's an easy year to remember.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I talked over your question. What
That's okay. Well, you have your own self-published company right now, Sugar Skull Media, which you started in 2015. But when you started out, you weren't necessarily going in just to become a self-publisher. How did you start out with Halloween Man? How did that process begin for you?
So Halloween Man was kind of a long and personal thing, actually. I was the character Halloween Man and most of the adjacent supporting cast were actually created for a role-playing game. There was a company called Maximum Comics and Games in Dallas. There's a small company we're going to put out indie superhero games, and they wanted to create characters that would tie into the different character types it could be in Halloween Man. Since I love horror movies, as you can probably see from the stuff in my apartment, I was assigned to do the supernatural character. And, when I was trying to come up with a name, I actually, I hit really bad writer's block. And there's a band that I like called the Misfits, and they have a song called Halloween. And I get obsessive, and I was just listening to that over and over and over again. It was like, Halloween, Halloween, Halloween Man. Halloween Man, like that's good. Superman, Batman, why not Halloween Man? And so I developed it from there. About a year.
Did you start publishing yourself, or did you start with by publishing through somebody else?
I never got to the point where I was publishing through somebody else. Like the idea was that they were going to spin these out of this game and do indie comics. About a year into development, I I was in a car accident that killed my twin, and I, the comic book suddenly became this thing that I needed to make myself get out of bed. It was like my therapy. It was the thing that motivated me because I just felt racked with guilt about this. And even the way the character looked, with this sort of like part of his body is human and part of his body is a monster, like that's kind of how I felt internally. So this thing that was created for commerce suddenly became much more important. So I went to Malcolm Harris, the guy that founded Maximum Comics, and I said, can I please take this and go off on my own? And then I started publishing it as a web comic, which was a relatively new thing at the time. And the thing about that is there wasn't really, nowadays when we think of web comics, a lot of what we think of is like a 3-panel to 4-panel humor comic. But back then, there wasn't that preconceived notion. So you could do like a Marvel DC style adventure book. And I did that for years. And around, 2004, 2005, I started to get small publishers interested and doing print versions of Halloween Man. And in fact, the first one was a small company called Across the Pond. And then I was with a company called Silent Devil for a while. And I was with Devil's Due for a hot minute. And then even Image very briefly for the Hack Slash versus Halloween Man crossover. And, now it's come full circle. Instead of working with these other publishers, I've just decided to do it myself. And a lot of what I do is based on digital sales through outlets like Comixology.
Ben, do you think that he was smart to stick with doing it himself rather than going through other companies? He mentioned Devil's Due and Image and that kind of stuff. I know you've worked with other companies before. Is there a benefit to being your own boss?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you work for yourself, you own everything yourself. You have control over everything yourself. You can present it the way you want it to be presented. There's no one to tell you that needs to be changed, that you have to do this, you have to do that. There is a benefit in, being your own boss, for sure.
And what about downsides? I mean, if you have a
The
bigger publisher to
downside
rely
is
on,
you also have to use your own money. That's the biggest downside, because if you have your dream, no one's going to finance it, unless you can convince people, to finance it for you. And that's where the benefit of crowdfunding comes around, because back in the 80s, you didn't have that. You had to use your own money. You had to dig deep into your pockets and finance your project yourself. Now you have an idea. If people like your idea, they're willing to plunk money down for it to support you, then that's great, because that allows you the freedom to not have to worry about how am I going to get this book out? People who believe in your project will fund you and get your book out.
Drew, I feel like you came up in a different time, because you came up with this idea. You came up during this time when web comics were a possibility and continued to grow as crowdfunding became bigger. Ben, you had to struggle through a lot of this, like you said, on your own. Were there other ways of getting investing help back in the 80s and 90s?
Well,
were you asking me or Drew?
I was asking. That was kind of a question for both, to be fair.
Back in the 80s, I asked my parents. And they said, all right. But I did pay them back. So it wasn't like I absconded with their funds. But I couldn't get very far anyway. But if you convince somebody to do it. The thing is, if you use other people's money, the problem is they're the ones you have to answer to. If you use your own, you have nobody to answer to except yourself.
That's fair.
The thing that he said about like having to go to definitely when I was getting started, I had to approach my parents and go, this is what I want to do with my life. This is a good idea. This is how I'm going to pay you back. And believe it or not, when my parents gave me that startup money, the way which it was only like $2,000. It doesn't actually sound like that much nowadays, but the way I paid them back was by selling Halloween Man t-shirts at comic book conventions. So like, it is however you do it, however you're going to do it. And sometimes you have to have a lot of humility about it. There's been times where I've even had to go. I'm a collector, as most people who are kind of nerdy are, and there's been times I've had to sell records, signed movie posters, memorabilia, all those kind of things to raise funds. Like, you do what you have to do. There's something very extraordinarily sort of blue collar about putting out an indie comic.
Oh, absolutely.
Is there a reason why it would be better to try to work with a bigger publisher?
Money. I often joke
Exposure.
I often joke. I was like, my gosh, sometimes I would just love to sell out and write, terrible Batman stories for, maybe they wouldn't be terrible. Maybe they'd be great.
Yeah,
But
don't write terrible Batman stories.
Good Batman stories.
Batman
The best Batman stories of a generation.
Hell yeah.
But I think, and I think anybody who does comics, there is an idea that when you do indie comics, that for some reason people start to get the idea that you hate Marvel and DC, and nothing could be further from the truth, because most of us who do comics, that's a lot of the first stuff we were exposed to. So I do love those characters, and I could probably tell stories with those characters, so it wouldn't necessarily just be about the money, but nothing that I would do for one of those publishers would be as personal as what I'm doing with Halloween Man.
Ben, you've worked with Marvel and other companies. Is there a reason why it'd be good to work with those guys? Not necessarily Marvel, but just any bigger company.
Well, I guess it depends on what your motivation is. I think for a lot of people who work for them, they just dream of wanting to work on these iconic characters, to put their stamp on a character that's been around for decades. It's to leave their mark. Basically, artists and creators, they want to leave something behind for future generations. I think that's their prime motivation. Also to get something out of their system, to share with the world. Now, for me, it was always been my dream to work for Marvel. In fact, before I even started Antarctic Press, I tried desperately to get into Marvel Comics. I sent them submissions, and back in the 70s, they actually took submissions, and I actually got a very nice letter from Marvel, saying, "Oh, hey, we got your submission, but we don't think you're quite there." But at least they took the time to actually write back to you. And I even got a no prize from them one time. It was a dream to work for Marvel at the time, but I knew I wasn't good enough to work for Marvel, but I thought I was good enough to just do my own thing. And I said, well, you know what? If people don't buy it, then I'll just find something else to do. But I could have opened. I opened my own comic book store. I did stuff on a flea market. I figured if I didn't make anything out of publishing comics, I could go become a comics retailer, which was my second.
Is part of it maybe
B.
controlling your own characters?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am a gigantic control freak. Although I think a lot of the artists I work with probably would tell you different, but it's like I was saying, like this was my therapy. This was so like being able to just say this is going to come out and not have like a publisher coming in and going, oh, this isn't selling X amount of copies, therefore this isn't any good for us, we can't put this out. I was in charge of that. I was in charge of saying where the bottom line was absolutely rock bottom, and I still am, because I know that there is an audience for it, thankfully. Those first 2 or 3 years I was able to grow because I was on the internet, and there's a dedicated readership for what I do now. But if I had to worry about what a big publisher was worrying, if they were looking at like the numbers or the amount of eyeballs on my comics those first few years, it wouldn't have lasted that long. Certainly, it wouldn't have lasted that long if it hadn't been a web comic, because I was in my early 20s and I certainly couldn't pay for printing So like being a webcomic allowed it to survive long enough to grow a readership.
We have a question right now from Leonard Pig, one of our viewers right now, asking what indie creators are you currently reading? And I thought that breaking away from our topic for a quick second, just to ask that and kind of promote other people. Ben, let's start with you. Is there any indie comics, and they could be inside of Antarctic Press if you want, but are there any indie comics that you are reading right now?
Oh, well, I read the can I say a 4-letter word that like I read Cat Shit 1,
Okay.
which is a manga. I read Punchline by Bill Williams, and I read Rags by Brian Ball. I read a lot of I just read a lot of everything. I'm really into right now rereading all my Bronze Age Marvels and stuff like that. But those are the ones I'm currently reading. Let's see, what else am I reading? That's pretty much it on a regular basis.
That's fair. There's always going to be others that get your attention from time to time.
Oh, absolutely. I used to read Walking Dead, but I stopped picking that up after a while. So, I also read Knights of the Dinner Table, which is also one of my.
Oh yeah, that's a classic. Drew, how about you? Any indie creators that you're currently following?
Well, I mean, not that he needs any help because he's successful for himself, but I read a lot of the stuff that Jim Ballant puts out, with his wife Holly, because I think that stuff is I like that kind of thing. I think that kind of thing is fun. The truth of the matter is I'm a voracious reader. Like I'm reading all the time. So I a lot of the times I can't even keep track of which comics I'm reading, but like off the top of my head, and I apologize if I'm not getting some of the creators' names right, but I read one of the comics that I've just fallen in love with just within the last year is a comic called The Department of Monsterology, which is written by Gordon. Again, I might be getting the name wrong. Gordon Rennie, and I think the artist is named. Geez, I feel terrible. PJ Holden, but it's if you're a monster fan, it's right up. It's definitely, if you like Halloween Man, it's right up your alleyway. And I'm actually I just purchased. I haven't read it yet, but and I'm blanking completely on the author's name right now. A book called Prim of War, which is about dinosaurs versus soldiers during the Vietnam War, and that's just like a regular book I got on it. I also feel like I would be remiss if I didn't say my editor on Halloween Man, Russell Hillman, publishes a lot of great indie horror comics through a company he founded himself called Freaktown, and all of those are available on Comixology. So if you like what I do on Halloween Man and you like the horror genre, you should definitely check it because he's a very talented writer in his own right. Also, editors underappreciated.
That's fair. Actually, I was going to ask something else right now, but now I'm kind of curious on the editor question. Ben, you've worked with a lot of editors over time. Have they been an important part? People always think about the writer and the artist, but I mean, there's letterers, there's colorists, there's art, there's editors. How important are those behind the scenes people when you're trying to run your own company?
Absolutely, you gotta. We all need. I think it's one of the most underrated positions in comics is being an editor because it actually can influence the direction of what you're doing, and can influence the direction of a comic book. Because sometimes you need that second set of eyes to really say, what, this works, this doesn't work, and sometimes you're blinded by your own creation and not realize what you're doing may not work or it may not resonate with people. And I think they're really important and definitely need to be more appreciated.
All right. Well, I wanted to jump back to something you said a little bit earlier. You mentioned Walking Dead. And I think one of the big dreams for a lot of creators is that their creations can go to other mediums. You, of course, created Warrior Nun, and there was a lot of talk at one point, I think, about making an anime, and now there's talk about making a live action show. What has the process been like that? Have you worked with other companies and studios about the concept of trying to make something in another medium?
Oh, absolutely. It is the actual Warrior Nun live action series is complete. It's 10 episodes that'll appear on Netflix, but uh, my producer tells me that Netflix won't reveal when they'll actually drop it because they're very secretive about release dates. So until I know for sure, it's pretty much up in the air. But it's always a great feeling when one of your properties goes beyond the boundaries of just the print media, because then you actually affect a larger group of people who will get to see your creation, and appreciate that, and that's what we're hoping. That's what I'm sure all creators sort of secretly want to happen to their creation. But the thing about it is that if your creation, you should focus on just your creation and not try to focus on just trying to sell to other mediums, because if it's good, people come to you. I mean, that's just the thing it is. At least that's what happened to me anyway.
I think far too many. And I'm not going to name names because that's tacky, but I do think far too many. I read far too many indie books that seem like they're failed movie pitches, and I completely agree that the first thing you need to focus on is making a good comic book, and like all the other stuff will happen afterwards,
Sure.
hopefully.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that the thing I see a lot about a lot of the properties that are being developed is that there's not a long history, with them. You could some of the books don't even have a dozen issues before they're optioned by some studio or some streaming service, and it says, well, what happens when the story ideas run out? It's like you did like 5 or 6 issues. I mean, how many episodes can we actually get out of that? With your like Halloween Man, you've got a 10-year history, so you have a lot of stuff that you can go back to and say, wow, we could take advantage of this character, we could use that character, we could use that storyline, because that's what you're trying to build. Marvel didn't succeed because they just started yesterday. Marvel had 50 plus, 70 plus years of material they can go back on, and that's what makes them, people want to see what they've done.
And
So
do you mind
really
when producers do that? If they come to you and say, "Well, we're going to alter the story, or we're taking bits of this and bits of that, throwing it together," is it more important to you that the end product gets made, or do you want it to be as close as possible to your original vision?
Well, if you don't want your characters to be altered, don't go to Hollywood. Because the thing about it is that Hollywood's made of people who want to also, leave their mark on something, and also they have to take into account what made it work in comics does not necessarily work in, in other media. I mean, look at the way the Marvel universe has turned out.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
altered it a lot, but it works.
yeah, in name only. You look at what they've done. It's they can see bits and pieces, but they only picked out the bits and pieces that they thought would work, and then they just altered it the way they think it would sell. Because in the end, you're going to lose control of your creation. It's just you got to accept that fact.
See,
The only, yes, go ahead.
for me, and I've definitely had much less of having to deal with this kind of thing than you, for sure. But for me, anytime even like it's been talked about to adapt my thing, I have a very hands-off attitude. I'm just like, you cut me a check and I'm just going to go over here and still make comics. Like, and I have no ego about what they're going to do with it. I mean, there would be stuff that if they changed, I would be disappointed, but that is
Well,
what it is.
the thing is that as you gain more influence, then you have more say in how things come out. I mean, for instance, if let's say that you do get your Halloween Man option by somebody, and they actually produce it, but it's not anything like your original vision of the series, and that's a possibility. But they must have seen something good in your creation to want to do that. Okay, they're not going to toss millions of dollars into a project that say, oh well, no one's going to watch this stuff, because they saw this as potential to reaching a larger audience. But and if it's a success, then you will have more influence on how things go with your perhaps your next creation or the future of what is already out there. So right now I have no influence on Warrior Nut at all. Okay, I can suggest, I can say things, but to be honest, I am a non-entity to them. The only thing I have going for me is that I put in my contract I got creator credit, in the opening credits. So other than that, I've got nothing, as far as the development. But they have 30 plus years of Warrior Nun stories they can go through. That if the series is a success, they can draw on that, till forever in perpetuity. They can take this character, develop that character, use this storyline, use that storyline. I've done over 100 plus issues of Warrior Nun that they can draw on. And that's a lot of story possibilities.
I played a clip a second ago of this anime adaptation of Warrior Nun that you put online a few years back. What's the story behind that? Was that something that almost happened, or?
Well, this is the mid '90s, and Warrior Nun was a huge hit for AP, Antarctic Press. We were literally just swimming in money, so I thought, you know what? Let's develop this to see if we can sell it to Hollywood. Because at the time there was a huge surge in the animated series, and we thought, well, if we put some money behind it, we probably might be able to sell it. So we spent a huge amount of money to get it done, and we took it to try to sell, to pitch to various production companies. And every single one of them turned it down, saying they just didn't understand it. It was kind of weird. We didn't know what was going on. What audience are you trying to go to? And we said, we never actually thought about that. We thought if we just did it, people would just buy it, but it was a very good interesting learning experience.
Now, Drew, you've also had made efforts of reaching out to the public, but you've had gone a different direction with the crowdfunding and working with Comixology. And I feel like you've gained a lot of traction there. Am I wrong? You did that. You mentioned Hackslash earlier. How did that process come about? Because, like you said, you started off just kind of doing these things yourself. How did entering into Comixology happen?
Well, Comixology happened because I was working with MonsterVerse. I would like to think that was like my big idea, but when Comixology first started happening, I actually kind of felt like that was a step backwards because it was online, and I had done the web comics thing, and I wanted to be in print because that was stature, and I had just very recently done, that crossover with Hackslash, which ended up being published by Image Comics. So I was like, come on. But when I started working with MonsterVerse, they were like, okay, we're doing a two-pronged approach. We're doing, print through and we're going to get it into comic book stores, but we're also going to do this Comixology thing. And it did remind me very much of what I liked about digital, because a lot of the times with indie comics, you're only going to get into so many comic book stores. Whereas with digital, you have a global audience. I have fans in Australia, England, South America. That's just off of the top of my head, like all over the world. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I was just focused on the print thing. Now, what ended up happening with MonsterVerse, and this is when it's still one of the weirdest professional experiences I've ever had in my life, is from what I understood, at least what I was being told at the time, Halloween Man was the best-selling MonsterVerse book, and that was great. But then, Kerry Gamble, the guy that was the publisher, who is an industry legend, he came to me and he's like, so Legendary Pictures is buying out MonsterVerse. They're gonna use that as the name of their, what they're gonna put out their Godzilla movies is, and I'm gonna take a step back from publishing. I understand you want to keep going. I think you should approach Comixology. So I did, and you know, I had the contact info. I would have contact information I absolutely would not have had without Carrie. By the way, I have to stress that. Like he, you know, he put me in touch with some people, and I said, okay, I want to keep doing this, you know, and I don't want to restart the series. I want the numbering to stay the same and everything. And through the course of like some emailing back and forth and some you know, phone calls and things like that, here we were, and you know, here we are. And Halloween Man has gone on to be more and more successful each year, and that's primarily focused on Comixology. Like most of what I do is that I you know, I have books to sell. You know, I will directly occasionally contact comic book stores and go, okay, do you want to carry this? But you know, a lot of comic book stores, and I understand this because retailers have to worry about their bottom line. They will be like, okay, you know, what is this? And you know, they're going to want to put something on consignment or something. And I'm like, no, if you can't pay me directly, I can't sell you my books. And I know that I have this big of a fan base, and I know that because of Comixology. So, you know, most of my print sales, I am in some comic book stores, but most of my print sales at this point are actually through conventions or through crowdfunding, which I've also done well with.
Ben, what do you think about that idea of digital? Antarctic Press is now on Comixology. I was just saying a little bit earlier that you can find Ninja High School on Webtoon, which is a Korean app for specifically webcomics. Do you think that this is a good method to go if somebody's starting out in the industry? Should they start by trying to do these kind of digital publishing, Ben?
Well, it's certainly, you cannot, you know, stop the march of progress. The thing is that it's the future, you know, and the sooner that creators can adapt to that, the better they're going to be. You know, the thing is, there's always going to be a demand for, you know, print, because people just like to hold something. It's visceral.
And I don't want to come off like I'm against that. Like I absolutely understand that.
Oh,
that
sure.
need.
You're taking, you know, you do whatever it takes to promote your creation, you know, to get it out there, because otherwise, what's really the point of doing it? You know, if you want to do it for your own self pleasure, that's fine. But if you want to try to do it to try to monetize it some way, to get your ideas out there, to get your creation out there, this is what you have to do. You know, it's just simply part of the overall plan to expose your creation to as many eyeballs as possible, because that's really what's going on in the end. Because you may have the greatest idea in the world, but it means squat if nobody's reading it.
Speaking of supporting creations, Ben, what's Indie Wars? What's going on with that?
Well, when this whole COVID thing came down, the idea, there was an idea around where I can't remember who actually suggested it.
I saw it being discussed on your Facebook profile. There was a lot of back and forth between you and your fans and other creators.
Yes, there was a suggestion that Marvel and DC should get together and do some sort of huge crossover event. And I thought, that's a good idea. I should do that with independent comics. So, but I don't have, you know, the characters that Marvel and DC have, but I do have Ninja High School. So I use that as sort of the basis, and I just put out an open call. I says, hey, indie creators, if you want to, you know, put together, let's do it a massive, you know, crossover, you know, using Ninja High School as a base, and then just whatever character and story you can create using those characters, let's get it together. I'll put it together. I'll fund it. I'll get it printed. You know, I'll get everything done, and I'll find a way to get everyone paid as far as the stories are concerned. But let's just go ahead and do it. Have fun. You know, just do some big event for ourselves. You know, just say, you know, if Marvel and DC don't want to do it, then let's show that we, as independent comic creators, can do it and do something that is fun and exciting, and you know, we'll get people to want to read our books. You know,
what do people have to do to get involved with Indie Wars?
I have some guidelines, but the basic is that as long as you use the 3 characters from Ninja High School, Ichiku, Azrael, and Jeremy, you know, and put them in whatever situation you want them in, whatever look you want to give them, you know,
like different styles of art and stuff. They don't all have to be anime.
Yeah, in fact, I actually encourage that, because I think it's great when people just use their own styles and interpret the, you know, the characters in whatever style they're comfortable with, and other than that, it's pretty much a free for all. I have a certain, base storyline you have to follow, which is very simple. They appear and then disappear. Whatever happens in between is up to you. So it's open to any independent creator who wants to do it. I have no page count. I'm gonna see how many pages I get at the end of at the 1st of July, and that's going to be the book. So if I get 10 pages, that's the book. If I get 1,000 pages, that's going to be the book.
I think I've already seen quite a few on your social media.
Yeah, and I have actually built up quite a bit of pages so far, but I just want to see how far it goes, see where it goes. And once I get all the pages in, I'm going to put it together and then put it out.
And then, Drew, your most recent big push was for the Halloween Man Valentine's Day special. And I remember, you were talking about a lot about that online with, you have much dinosaurs going to be involved because, again, when you think Valentine's Day, you think dinosaurs.
Of course.
And
I do.
as well people should. But my question is, you were doing that around the time that this, what Ben mentioned,
Yes.
the COVID thing started. Did that affect progress any? Are you still pushing for that?
We are going to complete it. We are actually near to completing the second part. So the first part did come out. Mm-hmm. And thank you again to all of our backers for being patient and everything. But literally when basically the entire world started getting shut down, that was the week that our crowdfunding ended on Indiegogo. And the original, thankfully, the original artist, Jason Wilson, who's a very talented guy, draws amazing dinosaurs. He worked a day job that was very much tied into the crisis. So suddenly he was having to, work 60 to 80 hour work weeks, if you can believe that. And he just didn't have time to devote it. Now, thankfully, he had already given us all of his layouts for part 2. And when I say layouts, I mean they were very, very detailed. So what I've been able to do is pass them off onto one of my other equally talented artists, a woman named Andrea Montano, who is now going in and completing it. And we're going to have the second part out. Hopefully sooner rather than later, and we can get it out to all the people that want it. And, this is a publishing challenge like I have never seen in my entire life, and I hope I never see it again. But in some ways, I think that this could end up being good for indie creators who still continue to put stuff out, because Marvel and DC, and again, I have friends that work for Marvel and DC. I'm not completely trying to put them down, but they kind of choked, in my opinion, the first few months, whereas indie creators were already like what Ben is doing with Indie Wars, and I'm continuously still putting in new issues to Comixology through this, and of course, digital. While our retailer friends were out of commission, digital took on a new importance, which is of course very good for indie creators. And now retailers are coming back, thankfully, and I hope they can bounce back in a big way. But I think this whole experience has shown off the resilience of indie comics creators and the ingenuity of indie comics creators in a big way, and I think we all have a lot to be proud of.
I think it's really interesting that this whole thing that we put it. You mentioned Marvel and DC. I have recently become kind of addicted to buying the digital comics off the Marvel and DC and Images apps and stuff. And although I do try to support the comic stores as much as possible, buying trades and going to events, and
as well, you should
telling my high school students about it whenever they have an event, But when this started, Marvel, DC, Image, they all just stopped. They stopped publishing because the stores couldn't open, which makes sense. And they stopped going digital because they didn't want to disadvantage the stores, which also makes sense. But it's interesting how this has created a bit of a vacuum that indie creators are kind of, jumping at and saying, look, people still want to read new comics. People still want to make them. Let's see what we can do. I think it's pretty cool. I wanted to ask one last thing, and then we can sign off. And that is, since both of you guys have now had a couple decades involved in creating your own independent comics, do you have any advice for others? Let's start with you, Ben. Any advice for somebody starting off for the first time? What should they do or not do?
Well, they always say the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. The thing you have to do is just sit down and start creating material. You can't publish vapor. You have to create something in order to take advantage of it. Is the fact is that you just got to sit down, no matter what, and just start creating something, because that's really the first most important advice I would do. Once you've created something, then I think everything else will just fall into place.
And Drew, how about you?
Well, first off, I want to respond to a comment from our live chat here, that they love that in true goth fashion that I am sitting in the dark. Well, of course, it's World Goth Day. I have to celebrate the best I can while we are in quarantine. But to dovetail off of what Ben said, I think there's a lot of people approach me and go, okay, how do you know when you have made it? How do you know you are in the comic book industry? And the answer to that is, once you put out your first comic book, you are in the comic book industry. Congratulations. Just don't get too frustrated. Don't get there's going to be lots and lots of false starts. There's going to be lots and lots of things that are going to seem like, okay, I've made it. And you may think you have not made it, but then from the outside looking in, there's a lot of people who think that you have. So like success looks different to everybody else. And I think that is something that's important to keep in the back of your mind as you make your way through your comic book career, because it's a tough industry, and it takes a lot of mental fortitude to not get down on yourself because you don't think you're doing quite as well as you think you should be, because you probably are doing better than you think. That was my long-winded response.
I think it's great. I want to thank you guys both so much for coming by today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome.
Well, that was our talk. I want to once again thank our guests, Ben Dunn and Drew Edwards. It has been amazing having them both on there. I really hope you guys go seek out their stuff again on Comixology, and as soon as comic book stores open again, and some of them already are opening now, actually, in stores as well. Thank you guys very, very much. For now, keep making myths.